He offered a ride to a girl hitchhiking in the rain, not knowing she was a runaway heiress. Billions. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The rain poured in relentless sheets over the darkened stretch of Route 9, headlights slicing through the silver haze, reflecting off the slick asphalt like liquid mirrors. Jake Thompson gripped the steering wheel tighter, his old Chevy's tires squelching with every puddle they passed. The night was quiet, too quiet, except for the steady thrum of raindrops hammering the roof. That's when he saw her, thumb raised and soaked through, standing on the shoulder with a desperate tilt in her posture, shivering violently under the thin jacket clinging to her small frame. Without thinking twice, he slowed, signaled, and pulled to the side, the wipers furiously battling the downpour to keep his view clear. The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then, as if sensing the sincerity in his motion, she darted toward the car, slipping slightly on the wet shoulder, and climbed in, brushing droplets from her hair, leaving streaks on the seat. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling but determined, eyes wide, darting to the dashboard where he had tossed an old towel for her to dry her face and hands. Jake nodded, giving her a faint smile, the corners of his lips tugging up despite the rain running down his own forehead. "No problem. Where are you headed?" His voice was calm but laced with curiosity. She swallowed hard, fumbling with the strap of her small backpack. "Anywhere safe. I just need to get out of the storm," she murmured. Her eyes were large, revealing both fear and a strange depth that intrigued him. As he pulled back onto the slick road, the tires splashing water, Jake stole glances at her, noting the way her soaked hair clung to her cheeks, the subtle tremor in her fingers, the way she hugged herself like a fragile statue in motion. Every instinct screamed caution, yet something about her presence demanded his protection. "You don't usually hitch in the rain like this, do you?" he asked, trying to break the silence, his tone casual but gentle. She let out a small laugh, more nervous than amused. "I'm not from around here. I didn't know what else to do. I just needed to get somewhere safe." Jake nodded, turning onto a quieter side road, the city lights dimming as they moved toward the outskirts, puddles reflecting the moonlight in fractured patterns. "I'm Jake," he offered, reaching to adjust the rearview mirror to catch her expression. "And you are?" She hesitated, then simply said, "Lila," voice barely audible over the rain pattering on the roof. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence filled only by the hum of the engine and the relentless rain. He noticed her backpack, worn but neatly packed, a hint that she had planned to travel alone despite her youth. A pang of curiosity struck him. Who was this girl, and why was she out here in this storm? Lila stared out the window, watching the blur of wet trees and lampposts pass, fingers tapping nervously against her knee. "Do you mind if I just sit quietly?" she asked finally. "Of course," he replied, eyes back on the road, aware of the fragile tension in the air, the way each drop of rain seemed to underscore the uncertainty between them. The car continued in silence, the storm wrapping them in a cocoon, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than a simple ride through the rain. He caught her gaze briefly, and something unspoken passed between them: trust, vulnerability, and an unarticulated bond forming in the quiet chaos of a stormy night. The storm had begun to ease as Jake maneuvered the Chevy onto a quiet back road, the headlights glinting off wet leaves and puddles. Lila sat silently, hugging her knees to her chest, the small towel wrapped loosely around her shoulders offering little warmth. Her breathing was shallow, almost mechanical, and Jake could sense the tension radiating from her every movement. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, noting the subtle tremor in her hands and the way she kept stealing glances out the window, as if expecting danger to emerge from the darkness. He realized that helping her was no longer just about offering a ride. It was about providing a small sense of safety in a world that clearly had not been kind to her. "Do you want to talk about why you are out here tonight?" he asked gently, keeping his hands steady on the wheel, his voice calm but inviting. Lila hesitated, biting her lower lip, eyes darting toward him, then away again. I needed to leave, she whispered, voice almost breaking. I cannot stay there any longer. Everything feels wrong. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words without needing more detail. You are safe with me, he said, the words simple but deliberate, as though repeating them aloud could make them more real. I will make sure nothing happens to you on my watch. She let out a shaky breath, a hint of relief softening her features, and for the first time since she got in the car, she relaxed her grip on the towel. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now, pattering softly against the roof, and the lights of the city in the distance created a hazy glow that reflected off the puddles like scattered jewels. Jake could not help but notice the contrast between the delicate vulnerability of Lila and the apparent strength that she had carried alone up to this point. He thought about the risks he was taking, picking up a stranger in the middle of the night, but something about her compelled him to continue, as if fate had placed her there for a reason he could not yet understand. Where are you heading? He asked again, breaking the silence that had settled comfortably between them. Lila hesitated, then spoke softly. Anywhere I can just disappear for a while. I do not have a plan. I only know I cannot go back. Jake understood the need for discretion, for anonymity, for safety. He slowed the car as they passed a deserted park, its swings swaying in the wind, and the quiet resonance of the moment allowed both of them to catch their breath. We can go wherever you feel safe, he offered, his eyes briefly meeting hers in the rearview mirror. If you want, I can take you to a diner up ahead. Warm food, dry seats, and nobody will bother you. A faint smile flickered across Lila's face, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to show a spark of trust. That would be good, she murmured. The Chevy rolled along the slick road, tires hissing over puddles. And Jake kept his gaze on the road, while also monitoring her subtle reactions. She began to relax slightly, brushing damp hair from her eyes and adjusting her backpack so it rested more comfortably. The diner came into view, its neon sign flickering, casting a soft red glow onto the wet asphalt. He parked in the lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, and gestured toward the entrance. After you, he said, giving her a small nod. Lila stepped out carefully, the wet jacket sticking to her, leaving faint streaks on the floor of the car as she moved. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, warm, and filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of utensils. The smell of coffee and baked bread enveloped them, contrasting sharply with the damp chill outside. She took a seat in a corner booth, and Jake slid in across from her, both of them catching a moment to shake off the tension from the drive. He ordered 2 coffees and a small plate of food. Simple fare, but enough to ground them in the moment, to give them a temporary sense of normalcy. Lila wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the steam rise to her face, inhaling the comforting aroma. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second, and he saw a mixture of gratitude, caution, and the hint of a story untold. You do not have to tell me everything, he said softly. Just know that for now you are safe, and I am here. Lila nodded, her lips pressing together as if holding back a flood of emotion. The rain had slowed to a whisper outside, and for a brief moment, the world felt suspended, a quiet bubble of safety in which 2 strangers had found each other. In that quiet, Jake realized that helping her was no longer a single act of kindness. It was a step into a connection neither of them fully understood yet. And as they sat together in the corner of the diner, sipping coffee and sharing the warmth, the first seeds of trust, and a bond that would grow through the trials to come, were being planted. The storm had finally passed outside, leaving the streets glistening under the soft glow of the early morning sun, and Jake sat across from Lila in the small diner, watching as she nibbled at a piece of toast, her fingers still damp from the rain. And for the first time, he allowed himself to study her more closely, noting the subtle elegance in her posture, the way her eyes held a mixture of determination and fear, and how she seemed both fragile and resilient at the same time. He realized that despite her apparent vulnerability, there was a story she was not telling, a past that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Yet she carried it with a quiet strength that demanded respect. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about how many people in the world would have driven past her, ignoring her presence, leaving her to face the night alone. Yet he had stopped, offered his help, and now found himself unexpectedly invested in her well-being. a curiosity about her life stirring in his chest. Lila, meanwhile, took a deep breath, glancing out the window at the sun breaking through the clouds, the wet streets reflecting the city in shimmering patterns, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax, letting the warmth of the diner seep into her bones, feeling a small but significant sense of safety for the first time in days, and she met his gaze briefly, a flicker of trust passing between them. Jake decided to break the silence gently. "You do not have to tell me everything right now, but if you want to talk, I am here to listen," he said, his voice steady and reassuring, offering a quiet anchor in a world that had been chaotic and unforgiving for her. Lila hesitated, fingers curling around the mug in her hands, the warmth of the liquid grounding her. Then she spoke softly, almost to herself. "I ran because I could not stay there any longer. It was suffocating, and I had no one to turn to." And Jake nodded, understanding without needing further explanation, realizing that sometimes people needed someone to simply be present, to acknowledge their fear, and provide a hand to hold, even if only figuratively. The diner around them hummed with quiet activity, the occasional clink of silverware and murmur of conversation serving as a backdrop to their own small bubble of calm, and he felt an urge to protect her, not out of obligation, but because of a growing sense of connection, a recognition that her story mattered and that he could make a difference in her life in a way he had never anticipated. After a few minutes, he suggested they continue the journey to a safer location, somewhere she could rest and regroup, and Lila agreed, carefully standing, adjusting her backpack, and stepping out into the wet morning, the cool air brushing against her skin, and as she slid back into the Chevy, Jake could not help but notice the subtle luxury of her belongings. A designer scarf peeking from her bag, a glint of a fine watch, small hints that contrasted sharply with her current circumstances, planting the first seeds of intrigue about who she really was. He drove cautiously, the tires splashing through lingering puddles, and as they approached a quiet residential area, he suggested a small inn just a few blocks away, one that offered a safe, dry place to rest, and she nodded gratefully, her eyes softening as she allowed herself to trust him further, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. As they entered the inn and checked into a modest room, Jake placed her bag on a chair and offered her a seat, sitting opposite, and they shared a simple breakfast he had purchased at a nearby cafe, the warmth of the food and the gentle rhythm of conversation slowly bridging the gap between strangers, and Jake found himself asking small questions about her favorite places, hobbies, and dreams. Careful not to push too hard, allowing her to reveal herself in her own time. Lila responded cautiously, giving small glimpses into her life, moments of beauty and hardship, her voice tinged with both sadness and hope, and as they spoke, the bond between them began to grow, subtle but undeniable, an unspoken understanding, forming that they were no longer just two people in a car or a diner, but two individuals whose paths had crossed for a reason, the first step in a journey neither of them fully understood yet, a journey that would soon reveal secrets, test trust, and ultimately reshape their lives in ways neither could have imagined. And as Jake watched her stir her coffee slowly, her eyes meeting his briefly with a hint of gratitude, and something more profound, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him, knowing that helping her tonight was only the beginning of a story far larger than the rain, the roads, or the fleeting moments they had shared so far. After a brief moment of quiet over their simple breakfast at the inn, Jake and Lila gathered their belongings, stepping outside into the crisp morning air, where the remnants of the storm glistened on the pavement, the sunlight reflecting off puddles and fractured patterns that made the streets look almost ethereal. Jake slid into the driver's seat of the Chevy, carefully navigating the wet roads as Lila settled in, her eyes scanning the city as if seeing it for the first time, the tension from the previous night still lingering, but softened by the warmth and safety she had just experienced. As they drove, she spoke in hesitant fragments about the circumstances that had led her to leave home, avoiding names and details but painting a vivid picture of isolation and pressure, and Jake listened intently, his focus split between the road and the subtle shifts in her expressions, each pause and glance telling a story words could not convey. He offered gentle reassurances, small acknowledgments of the courage it took to leave, and his words seemed to ease her, if only slightly, the atmosphere inside the car shifting from one of fear and suspicion to cautious trust, And in those moments, he realized the depth of the responsibility he had taken on by simply stopping to offer her a ride. Yet there was no hesitation in his resolve, only a quiet determination to ensure she remained safe. As they approached a quiet neighborhood, Jake suggested a small cafe he knew that stayed open early, a place with friendly staff and a calm environment, ideal for her to gather her thoughts and for them to talk more comfortably. And Lila agreed, a tentative smile brushing her lips as she relaxed further, her posture softening, her fingers no longer clutching the towel or the edges of her backpack in nervous anticipation. Upon arrival, they found a corner booth near a window, the early sunlight filtering through and illuminating the space with a soft golden glow. And as they ordered tea and pastries, the simple domesticity of the moment grounded them both, creating a sense of normalcy that had been absent from Lila's life for weeks, perhaps months, or even longer. And Jake could feel a shift within himself as well, the act of helping her morphing into something deeper, a connection that neither of them had anticipated but could not ignore. As they spoke quietly, Lila revealed more glimpses of her background, small details that hinted at wealth and privilege, the fine stitching on her gloves, the subtle quality of her bag, the way she carried herself despite exhaustion and uncertainty. And Jake took mental notes without judgment, his curiosity growing. Though he sensed there was much more she had not shared, layers of her story waiting for the right moment to unfold. The conversation flowed cautiously, laughter occasionally breaking the tension as they exchanged small anecdotes, and Jake found himself opening up as well, sharing pieces of his own life, his struggles, the nights he had spent working odd jobs to make ends meet, the fleeting moments of loneliness that mirrored her own, creating a fragile but tangible bridge between them. After finishing their tea, Jake suggested they take a short walk in a nearby park to stretch their legs and clear their minds, and Lila agreed, the sun now fully out, glistening on the wet grass and casting elongated shadows across the paths. And as they walked, she spoke of the simple joys she had missed, the freedom to choose her own path, the desire to be seen as more than a name or a fortune. And Jake listened, absorbing the nuances, understanding that this was not just a runaway seeking shelter, but someone searching for identity and agency, and the weight of that realization pressed gently on him, deepening the empathy and protective instinct he already felt. As they returned to the car, the ambient sounds of the city settling into a soft rhythm around them, Jake knew the next steps were critical, that he needed to ensure Lila's safety without overstepping boundaries. And he felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that their journey together was moving from immediate survival toward the beginnings of trust. And as Lila buckled in, glancing at him with tentative confidence, he realized that this ride, this simple act of assistance, had set in motion a chain of events that would reveal hidden truths, test both their courage, and ultimately bind their lives together in ways neither could yet foresee. And as the Chevy pulled back onto the street, tires hissing softly over the wet asphalt, the first hints of revelation about who Lila truly was shimmered in Jake's mind, the mystery of the runaway heiress poised to unfold. After leaving the small park behind and settling back into the Chevy, Jake carefully navigated through the city streets toward a quieter part of town, the sun now fully illuminating the wet pavement and casting reflective glimmers on each puddle they passed. Lila sat silently in the passenger seat, her gaze flicking occasionally toward the buildings, then back out the window, absorbing the world around her while her hands rested lightly on her backpack, fingers tracing the worn straps as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment. And Jake stole glances at her from time to time, noticing the way her hair still carried damp strands from the rain, the subtle tension in her shoulders beginning to ease, and the faint lift at the corners of her lips when she realized she was safe for the first time in days. The silence between them was comfortable, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond forming, and Jake decided it was time to offer a sense of stability, suggesting they find a small community center he knew, a place where Lila could rest, shower, and collect herself without drawing attention, a sanctuary removed from the chaos that had propelled her into the streets the night before. And she nodded, her voice soft yet tinged with relief, as she said, "That sounds good," the simple statement carrying a weight of gratitude that Jake felt deeply. As they arrived, the community center loomed modestly against the backdrop of the city, its brick facade worn but welcoming, and Jake helped her carry her small bag inside, greeting the receptionist briefly before leading Lila to a private room where she could change into dry clothes and refresh herself. And as she unpacked the few items she had brought, he noticed subtle hints of her background, fine stitching on her gloves, a delicate watch peeking from beneath her sleeve, details that suggested a life of privilege she had clearly abandoned temporarily in order to escape. And Jake filed these observations away, his curiosity about her story growing even as he respected the space she needed to recover. Once she had settled, he offered her a simple cup of tea, and they sat together at a small table in the quiet room, the muted hum of the city outside providing a soft backdrop as they began to talk. Not just about survival, but about small dreams, fleeting hopes, and the human need for connection. And Lila, sensing his sincerity, allowed herself to share more. Speaking of pressures she had faced, expectations she could not meet, and the suffocating environment she had left behind, her voice steady but vulnerable, and Jake listened, offering quiet words of encouragement and affirmation, careful not to push too hard, acknowledging her strength while also providing a safe place for vulnerability. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by small laughter, the clinking of the teacup, and shared observations about the world outside the window, and Jake felt a deepening sense of responsibility, not just for her safety in the immediate sense, but for her well-being and autonomy. A realization that his choice to stop and help had extended far beyond the simple act of offering a ride, creating a connection that neither of them could ignore. As the afternoon light streamed through the window, highlighting the warmth of the room and the soft textures of the chairs and table, Jake noticed a subtle change in Lila, a relaxation in her posture, a willingness to meet his gaze, and he realized that trust was beginning to take root, fragile but present, a foundation that would allow her to reveal more of herself when she was ready. And as they finished the tea, he suggested taking a short walk in the courtyard behind the building, a small space with trees and benches that offered sunlight and fresh air, and she agreed, stepping outside and allowing the cool breeze to brush against her face, a simple yet profound gesture of reclaiming agency over her own movement. They walked slowly, sharing small talk and quiet observation, each word and glance deepening the unspoken understanding between them, and Jake could sense that this was not merely a respite from a stormy night, but the beginning of a journey that would uncover hidden truths, test courage and integrity, and slowly build a bond between two people whose lives had intersected at a moment of vulnerability, trust, and kindness. And as they returned to the room, the sun now angled through the branches to cast dancing shadows on the floor. Jake knew that the next steps would inevitably reveal more about who Lila truly was, and that the quiet trust they had begun to cultivate would soon face challenges that would demand both honesty and courage, the kind that transforms fleeting encounters into meaningful, life-changing connections. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the community center, casting long golden streaks across the room where Jake and Lila sat together. And for the first time since the storm, there was a sense of calm, a fragile stillness that felt almost sacred in contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Lila sipped her tea slowly, the warmth seeping into her hands and offering a small measure of comfort, and Jake watched her closely, noticing the way her shoulders had relaxed, the subtle softening around her eyes, and the way her fingers traced patterns absent-mindedly along the rim of the cup, each motion betraying a mind still cautious yet beginning to trust, and he understood that this was a delicate balance, that the foundation of safety and confidence they were building together depended on patience, respect, and subtle reassurance. As they spoke quietly about trivial matters at first, the softness of the morning light, the smell of fresh tea, the sound of distant traffic filtered through closed windows, Jake gently guided the conversation toward Lila's hopes and fears, never pressing, only listening and offering small reflections that validated her feelings and acknowledged the courage it had taken for her to leave home. And she responded in kind, allowing small glimpses of her past to slip through, stories that hinted at privilege and pressure, at isolation and expectations, details that painted a picture of a life far more complicated than the simple act of running away suggested. And yet, despite her careful phrasing, there was a vulnerability there that Jake felt honored to witness. The more she spoke, the more Jake recognized the subtle contradictions within her strength, wrapped in fear. independence tempered by longing for connection, and a resilience born of necessity. And he realized that this encounter, begun in a storm on a lonely road, had already begun to shape both their lives, bridging the chasm between two very different worlds through trust, empathy, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. As the morning progressed, Jake suggested a short walk around the courtyard, a small patch of greenery behind the center with benches, flowering shrubs, and the lingering scent of rain. And Lila agreed, stepping carefully onto the wet pavement, feeling the cool air on her skin, and for the first time, allowing herself to notice the softness of sunlight on leaves and the delicate flutter of birds in the trees, small details that made the world feel alive and less threatening. And Jake followed at a respectful distance, giving her space while remaining a protective presence, noting the subtle changes in her expression, the way her posture loosened, the small, almost imperceptible smiles that flickered across her face as she took in the sights and sounds around her. They walked slowly, their footsteps in rhythm with each other, sharing quiet observations and occasional laughter. And in that gentle exchange, a subtle but powerful connection began to form, a recognition that this was more than a single act of kindness, more than a temporary refuge, but the start of a bond that would carry through uncertainty, challenge, and revelation. And Jake felt a growing sense of responsibility, not only for her immediate safety, but for the trust she had placed in him, the fragile thread of belief in others that she had extended despite the hardships she had endured. After returning to the center, they settled back into the quiet room, Jake offering a final cup of tea as Lila organized her small belongings, and as the light shifted, painting warm hues across the floor, the first true sense of emotional intimacy began to emerge. Subtle glances, shared laughter, and comfortable silences that communicated understanding without words. And Jake recognized that while the road ahead would reveal truths, test courage, and confront fears, the bond they were forming in these quiet, unassuming moments was the foundation for trust, revelation, and ultimately, a life-changing connection. The kind that transforms strangers into allies, vulnerability into courage, and fleeting encounters into the beginning of a profound journey that neither could have anticipated when the rain first drove them together on that lonely road. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the warm glow of the sun began to fade, Jake and Lila remained in the quiet room at the community center, the soft hum of distant traffic and occasional laughter from a nearby playground forming a gentle backdrop to their conversation. And for the first time, Jake noticed a subtle tension returning to Lila's posture, a tightening around her shoulders and a wary glance that suggested she was carrying a weight she had not yet revealed. Sensing the shift, he leaned slightly forward, keeping his tone calm and steady. "You do not have to tell me everything right now, but if there is something troubling you, I am here to listen." And Lila hesitated, eyes lowering to the tabletop, fingers tapping lightly against the edge as if measuring whether it was safe to speak, before she finally whispered, "I do not know if I can trust anyone anymore. Not fully. Not after everything that happened." And Jake nodded, understanding that trust is a fragile thing, built slowly through consistent actions, and that the events of the past night and day had only scratched the surface of her fears and the complexity of her life. He decided to share a small piece of his own vulnerability, recounting nights he had spent working long shifts with little rest, struggling to make ends meet, moments when he had felt alone despite being surrounded by people, and the honesty in his voice, the calm determination in his eyes, seemed to give her the permission she needed to exhale, to release a fraction of the burden she had been carrying silently. And she lifted her gaze to meet his, the hint of a tear glimmering at the corner of her eye, quickly brushed away, revealing the raw mixture of fear, relief, and tentative hope that lay beneath her composed exterior. As they spoke, the conversation shifted toward practical matters, how she could find temporary shelter, access basic necessities, and ensure she remained safe. And Jake offered solutions that were grounded in reality, his careful planning and thoughtful consideration providing a stabilizing force that contrasted with the chaos she had escaped. And yet, even in the midst of discussing logistics, there was a subtle undercurrent of emotional connection, the way they listened to each other, responded to each other's concerns, and acknowledged each other's humanity, creating a bridge that had not existed the night before. After a short pause, Jake suggested a walk around the courtyard to stretch and breathe in the fresh evening air. And as they stepped outside, the temperature had cooled, the wet grass glistening in the soft light. And Lila moved with a cautious grace, her fingers brushing over leaves and benches as if reacquainting herself with the physical world, while Jake followed at a respectful distance, attentive to every small signal that indicated her comfort or discomfort. And he realized that every small choice he made, from where they went to how he spoke, carried weight in building the trust she had tentatively extended. As they walked slowly along the winding path, Lila began to open up further, recounting fragments of her life before leaving, moments that hinted at privilege, isolation, and expectation. Her voice quiet but steady, each word carefully measured, and Jake absorbed the details, noticing the incongruities between the outward signs of wealth and the inner solitude she had endured. Understanding that the story she was telling him was only the beginning, that layers of her past remained hidden, but that the act of sharing even these small pieces was a profound step toward connection. Returning to the building, they paused by the doorway, and Jake offered a simple reassurance. "For now, you are safe here, and I will make sure of it," his words carrying both commitment and empathy. And as she nodded, a mixture of relief and lingering wariness in her expression, he realized that they had crossed a threshold, that the bond formed through shared moments of vulnerability, protection, and trust was now undeniable, setting the stage for the revelations, challenges, and choices that would inevitably follow. And as the evening settled into quiet, both of them understood that their journey together had moved beyond a chance encounter in the rain to a connection that would test courage, integrity, and ultimately reveal truths that had the power to transform their lives forever. The next morning, the city streets glistened with the remnants of the night rain, and Jake guided the Chevy through quieter roads toward a small art gallery he had recently discovered, a place that offered both privacy and a sense of calm. And as Lila stepped out of the car, she felt the first spark of curiosity in days, the sunlight catching the damp strands of her hair and casting a golden glow on her face, her expression hesitant but open, and Jake walked beside her, offering subtle reassurances with small gestures. A hand lightly touching the small of her back as they approached the gallery entrance, a silent promise of protection and respect. Inside, the gallery was quiet, the soft hum of the overhead lights mingling with the faint scent of varnish and paper, and Jake led Lila past rows of abstract canvases and framed sketches, finally stopping at a small corner where a blank wall waited, the potential of creation palpable, and he turned to her with a tentative smile. "I thought you might like a space to express yourself, to show the world what you have kept inside." And Lila blinked, taken aback, the vulnerability she had carried so far meeting an unexpected gesture of trust and belief in her talent, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of gratitude, astonishment, and the faintest twinge of hope. Jake helped her set up her few supplies, a small sketchbook and a collection of pencils and brushes she had brought along. And as she began to draw, her hands moving with practiced precision, yet tinged with nervous energy, he observed quietly, offering only gentle encouragement, his presence steady and grounding. And the gallery, once silent and neutral, began to resonate with the quiet sound of pencil against paper, the scratch of graphite, marking the beginning of both artistic expression and emotional release. And Lila felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced in weeks, a momentary reprieve from fear and uncertainty, replaced with the joy of creation and the knowledge that someone believed in her. Hours passed with quiet conversation interspersed with stretches of concentrated work, and Jake shared small stories of his own experiences, his struggles, and small triumphs, not as advice but as connection, weaving a subtle thread of camaraderie and trust. And Lila responded in kind, showing glimpses of her past, fleeting moments that revealed strength, resilience, and the cultivated discipline of someone who had been forced to navigate a world of privilege and expectation from a young age, yet now sought autonomy and agency over her own choices. When she finally put down her pencil, a series of sketches completed with careful detail and evident passion, Jake took a step back, surveying the work and letting a quiet awe settle over him. And he could see not only her talent, but the story behind each line, each shading and contour reflecting both hardship and determination. vulnerability, and strength, and he realized that this moment was a turning point, a bridge from trust to revelation, and that the bond they had cultivated over rides in the rain, tea in a quiet diner, and walks in the courtyard had matured into something far more significant. Lila, sensing the importance of the moment, met his gaze, her eyes wide and glistening, and Jake offered her a small, respectful nod, acknowledging both the courage it had taken to share herself and the impact her openness had on him. And the gallery became more than a place of art. It became a sanctuary where the invisible walls around their hearts began to dissolve, a setting for honesty, empathy, and the subtle emergence of mutual care. As the afternoon waned and sunlight streamed across the polished wooden floors, Jake gently suggested that her work be shared with a few close contacts, hinting that the world could see the depth of her talent. And though Lila hesitated, the encouragement in his tone, the belief he had shown in her consistently, emboldened her to agree, the smallest smile flickering across her lips. And in that moment, both understood that this act of trust and exposure was more than artistic. It was emotional, a symbol of the connection, respect, and mutual understanding that had developed between them. And as they stepped out of the gallery later, the cool evening air brushing against their faces, Jake realized that by providing her this opportunity, he had not only offered support, but had allowed a revelation, the first glimpse into her true self, to surface safely, planting the seeds for further truths to emerge, trust to deepen, and perhaps, eventually, a life that would intertwine in ways neither had anticipated, the day's quiet acts of belief and validation marking a critical step in a journey that had begun with a ride in the rain, but was now blossoming into something far more profound and transformative. The following morning, the city was bathed in golden sunlight, the remnants of the previous storm leaving the streets sparkling as Jake guided the Chevy through familiar roads toward the downtown headquarters of Lila's family, a place that had loomed in her memories like both a fortress and a cage. And as they approached, she sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, the anticipation and nervousness in her posture unmistakable, yet tempered by the trust that had grown between them over the past days. Jake glanced at her briefly, offering a reassuring nod, and she returned it, a faint, tentative smile lifting the corners of her mouth, a silent acknowledgement that she was ready to confront what she had fled from, with him by her side as both protector and confidant. As they entered the towering building, the grandeur of the marble floors, polished brass railings, and the soft echo of footsteps filled the air, creating a sense of awe that contrasted sharply with the simplicity of the community center and the small gallery where she had rediscovered herself. And Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself, feeling the weight of her past and the responsibility of the moment, yet also the strength she had gained from the journey they had shared. Jake stayed close, but allowed her to lead, his presence steady, the subtle gestures, a hand near her shoulder, a reassuring glance conveying both support and respect for her autonomy. And as they reached the office where she would finally reveal herself, Lila paused, glancing at Jake with a mixture of fear, determination, and gratitude, silently acknowledging that this was the culmination of trust, built through kindness, protection, and shared moments of vulnerability. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, announcing herself to the staff and her family representatives, and Jake watched as shock, surprise, and then recognition washed across their faces, the reality of her return and her choices sinking in. And he felt a quiet pride, not only in having safely guided her to this point, but in having witnessed her reclaim agency over her life, the culmination of courage, honesty, and trust unfolding in real time before him. Lila's family, initially stunned, began to respond with questions and concern, yet the confidence she now radiated, tempered by humility and the understanding she had gained during her days away, allowed her to navigate the interactions with poise, her voice steady, her explanations clear. And Jake observed silently, feeling the depth of the transformation that had occurred, the juxtaposition of the girl he had found in the rain and the young woman now standing before her family, composed and self-assured, was striking and profoundly moving. As the conversations concluded, Lila turned to Jake, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and an emotion that transcended words, and she said softly, "I could not have done this without you." and he shook his head gently, a small smile on his lips. "You did all of this yourself. I only helped you get here safely." The truth in his words reinforcing the equality of their journey and the respect he held for her strength. They stepped outside into the courtyard where the sunlight glinted off fountains and flower beds, and Jake produced a small, unassuming package he had kept from their earlier encounters, a symbolic token of their shared experiences. And as Lila opened it, revealing a sketchbook filled with moments they had discussed and the beginnings of her own artistic creations, she laughed softly, a sound of relief and joy, and he realized that this gesture, small yet profoundly meaningful, marked the final bridge between past and future. Fear and trust. Isolation and connection. With a final glance at each other, their eyes conveying unspoken understanding and acknowledgement of the bond that had formed through storm, vulnerability, and kindness, Jake extended his hand in a gentle but deliberate motion, and Lila took it, the touch sealing both a moment of gratitude and the promise of a shared journey ahead. And as they walked together through the sunlit streets, the city alive with possibility around them, both felt the weight of the past lift slightly, replaced by hope, trust, and the quiet knowledge that even in the most unexpected circumstances, compassion and courage could create a connection strong enough to transform lives, and that the story that began with a ride in the rain had now reached its resolution, a harmonious blend of safety, revelation, and the beginnings of a bond that would endure.